Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Mike, it is Monday, March 30th.
Good morning.
And good morning to you. And I read a couple of articles and then some other articles that are about specific things, but two articles that to me are great bookends about the topics that we've been discussing since our podcast began, going all the way back to the island and then all the way through many of the discussions that we've had. And one of them is a article titled 5 Centuries of a Forbidden Bible. And this was started with William Tyndall, and he wrote that he translated. He was the first person to translate the Bible into English, and then it was smuggled into England in March of 1526.
Yes.
And so then the other article, which would be the other bookend, is an article by Bruce Gilley, and it's What Do Democrats Mean by Democracy? So we're going to discuss what democracy is from the American perspective, because the European perspective of democracy is not the same. It's not the opposite. It's just not the same.
So the first story is we're going to see is the introduction of democracies, the availability of Scripture to the ordinary person, and authority then passed to ordinary people from the clerics and from the monarchs.
Yes.
All right. This last one is threats or claims that democracy is about to end. And some of the claims that are being made now about what's going to happen if we don't make changes to some of our institutions, and is that democracy or not?
Right.
It's sort of a birth and death kind of story.
Right. I mean, it's possible to have democracy if you rig elections so that you never lose. So, for example, Putin always wins the elections in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and they claim to be what's the actual name of the Soviet Union?
Well, it's no longer the Soviet Union, but back when it was the People's Republic.
Yeah.
The Soviet People's Republic or something like USSR, United Soviet
Socialist Republic.
Yes, that's exactly what it was.
And doesn't China have a similar name? They pretend to be a...
Well, I'm not possibly. I'm not going to say
but they all pretend to respect the interests of individuals.
The will of the people.
Yeah.
They all pretend to.
Right.
And the ones that do respect the will of the people have well-functioning democracies, which ours has been for 200, essentially working for 250 years, with the exception of slavery, which was a huge exception.
Yes.
But we're not going to get off into that one, that particular issue today. We're going to be talking about the larger theme about how did democracy develop in Europe, and particularly in England, where democracy had not existed prior.
Right.
And then
you had an elite devolving to governance by the people, more than it had been. And now you still have the similar theme with elites and populism. And all the commentary we see of skepticism of populist movements, that they're dangerous, et cetera. Is that democracy? Is populism democracy? That's the kind of thing I'd like to explore today.
All right, we'll do that. Okay, so the first one, we'll just talk. We'll give it a little bit about the story, because for me, when I read the article, it was even though it happened 500 years ago to this month.
Wow.
1526. It happened March. It happened 500 years ago this month.
You know what day? Did they say?
No, I don't. It doesn't say the date, but it does say the month.
Yeah.
And that's when an English translated New Testament was smuggled into England, and so there's a few things. The translation of Scripture at that time was banned in Catholic England, with punishments ranging from imprisonment to execution. So that's how seriously the Catholic Church guarded their worldview and their interpretation of religion.
Well, their prerogative to interpret it for the people and tell them what it said.
Right.
They spoke in Latin, which was a language not available to most English people.
Okay.
And I guess to most Germans, too. I mean, the Protestant Reformation happened in Germany.
Yes, and it had started.
Yes.
It had already started.
think it was 15 and 10 years before this or
Yes.
something. Is very
Yeah.
rapid. And all of this is based on the invention of the printing press about 100 years before.
Exactly. And it is interesting that you note it was about 100 years before. So it's interesting how long it took for certain inventions way back then to have a true impact, because until the printing press, literally there were no books that were not handwritten.
Right.
And so only the wealthy at that time, only the wealthy had any reason to be able to read, because there were so few books that somebody could buy that there wasn't anything to read.
Well, as you and I know from starting new businesses, the invention is the mousetrap is just the first 5 or 10%.
Right.
It's changing people's habits and practices that is very hard and expensive.
Yes. And you also have, in this case, the Catholic Church was a gigantic institution
Right.
that opposed having a written New Testament where it had control. And so at any rate, Tyndall wrote the New Testament.
Well, he translated it into English.
He translated it. Yeah, thanks.
In beautiful English, they call it. I think they call that the King James version. Although I'm a little confused by this article.
It became the basis for the King James,
because that was a council that rewrote the King James version.
Yes.
That it was respected for its literary quality.
Yeah, but it was still based on his translation.
Yes. Okay.
And it was his translation that the Judeo-Christian faith. If you want to fast forward just a bit to the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence asserts that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights.
Yes.
And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes.
And what Jefferson was saying in that is that no institutions created by man can impose their will on inalienable rights, and if they do it unjustly. Well, that was over 200 years later.
Yes.
But when this came out, the Judeo-Christian religion in the New Testament, it undermined the authoritarian nature of the king and the church, because back in those days, the kings subscribed to this notion of the divine right of kings. A loose interpretation of that is whatever the king says is right is divinely inspired. Therefore, it must be legal, no matter what it is. Even if he says off with his head, well, he speaks through the church to God, so that off with his head must be divinely inspired,
Yeah,
and so that's why kings had so much power.
Great way of keeping power if you can convince people that's the case.
Yes.
The way I like to think about this devolution is that it makes room for conscience.
Okay.
And an individual can make their own mind up about what these scriptures mean. It can apply to more than scriptures, to laws and to moral principles and things like that. Here we're talking about scriptures. But to me, what's really important is the emphasis on conscience and the individual's control over conscience.
But in the absence of having this written New Testament, there wouldn't be an ability for you and I, based on this, to discuss conscience.
Yes, they wouldn't have it available to interpret.
Yeah. And so what this did was, and this was in 1526, the Glorious Revolution happened in England in 1689. And that's when the Parliament got so frustrated with the king that the Parliament formed an army, and the king had an army, and they skirmished throughout the territory. And eventually the king surrendered. And then the Parliament ultimately tried to figure out then what to do once you had a surrendered king, and the king was still demanding that the king remain king and be reinstalled as king. And they finally got so frustrated with him that they tried him, convicted him, and beheaded him. And when you behead the king in that form of, when there is that form of government, you literally behead the executive branch of government. Because as soon as the king is beheaded, all the advisors to the king cease to have any power at all. And so then what that did was that left the Parliament to have to come to terms with itself to then reestablish whatever ought to be established, that needs to be, because there are all these problems. That's why the Parliament and king were having all these issues in the first place.
Well, as I recall the history, they ended up switching back and forth. They had a Catholic king that was deposed, and you had a Protestant reign for a while. Is that Cromwell?
Well, Cromwell was he was a captain in the cavalry of the Parliament, and the leadership of the Parliament, both in the Parliament itself, but then more the military side of the army for the Parliament. They were older people, and by the time the Glorious Revolution had resolved itself and the king was deposed and the Parliament was so fractious that it couldn't figure out what to do, and they turned to the leading person who was in the military, who was Oliver Cromwell, and he had now risen. He wasn't even looking for the job,
and they wanted. My question wasn't he Protestant?
Yes, yeah, he was.
Yeah, and then they restored later.
Well, but let me just finish. Let's just they restored later, but Cromwell comes in, and they wanted to make him king, and he said, "No, we just beheaded a king. I don't want to be king."
Right.
So they named him Lord Protectorate, and then he tried to get the Parliament to agree to what he thought should be done, and Parliament wouldn't agree. They stayed fractious, and nothing was moving in any direction in a meaningful way. And then Oliver Cromwell ended up beheading and killing some of his adversaries to try to get Parliament in line, which is why Oliver Cromwell is both reviled and hated, depending on which side that. Loved and hated.
Yeah.
Loved and hated, depending on which side of that divide you were on. Yes, and then England after that then went back and forth, and it went all the way up to when we had the Declaration of Independence. You had King George, and I don't even know if King George was a Catholic or Protestant king. I just know that Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense that attacked the king much more than the Parliament, and the Declaration of Independence then latched on to the language in Common Sense.
I'm just thinking we have our version of this, and it's not killing the opposition. It's just lock her up, or these lawfare efforts to lock up your opponents.
Yeah.
That's the way we do it.
And so we're going to get into that in just a little bit as to the institutions that are under attack today.
Yeah, right.
But going back, sticking with the original piece of 500 years ago, it moved then very, very slowly. It took over 100 years, over 150 years, from the time that the New Testament was translated and available in England before the Glorious Revolution. But the Glorious Revolution, the basis for it was based in part on the English translation of the New Testament, and so I just find it fascinating and that's why freedom of religion was such an important part of our Constitution. It's why it's right up there in the First Amendment, and so it's interesting that religion was the foundation for moving from a authoritarian form of government to a democracy. And then that was best captured in the Declaration of Independence and the way that we viewed government and the relationship of government to the people. And there was a lot of religious thought that was part of that.
So there's a couple of buckets here. One is conscience, I mentioned before.
Yes.
What do you believe? And you should be free to believe what you want to believe about metaphysical matters, maybe is the way I would put it. But also mixed up in this is a question of authority and sovereignty. Who really has the power and the authority to drive things, to govern things? And you start with the idea that God's in charge. You still have that in Islamic countries. They're very emphatic on this point.
Well, not God, it's Muhammad. And there is a distinction.
Well, I would argue that, but let's not get distracted on that right now.
Okay.
I don't think that's right.
Right.
But the point is you went from God to kings and then to individuals, and we're still fighting this out a little bit. We're not really going back to established churches, but you do have people that say that democratic institutions are not so great, and that we need to change them. And this is what we're going to get into about what's being threatened and discussed currently in our country.
Yeah, but the way it moved is interesting, from authoritarian to democracy, and then the American form of democracy just very quickly. When the Revolutionary War ended, and we've said this before, but it bears repeating. When the Revolutionary War ended, in fact, George Washington was asked about did he fight the Revolutionary War because he presided over the writing of the Constitution. And they asked him if this is why he fought the Revolutionary War. He said, "No, I fought the Revolutionary War so we could be a sovereign country." Mm-hmm. And so after the Revolutionary War, we were governed by the Articles of Confederation, which were voluntarily written. Back to your point about conscience, they were voluntarily written among the 13 states, and they took about 90 days, 120 days to draft. Took 2 years to get them ratified by 13 states, which I found really remarkable.
And herd the cats.
And then it lasted for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they recognized, the leaders of the various colonies recognized that this way of this basis for government was not sustainable.
Right.
And so they met in Philadelphia, and they thought they were coming to greatly amend the Articles of Confederation.
That's what they were authorized to do.
That's what they were authorized to do, and they eventually drafted the Constitution. But the two things, and we reiterate this.
Let's just say before we go on, the Constitution itself was not unanimously approved. There was a compromise. Years of disputes.
Well, and they're also even there in Philadelphia, there was enormous compromise that they and some of the compromises were bad, but they were necessary to move from something that would have been worse. And so you could argue that they moved from something, the Articles of Confederation, which were worse than the Constitution that they agreed to. And but the Constitution they agreed to wasn't perfect. That's why they said in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union.
Yeah, and it reminds me of Churchill's remark that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yeah, and which is really the Articles of Confederation. The two major flaws in the Articles of Confederation were each state could coin its own money, and each state managed its own rules regarding commerce, meaning tariffs or anything like that. And in very short order, in 5 years, they found that the states competed so much with each other that they feared that they were going to become like Europe, and Europe was a continent with multiple countries that were constantly at war with each other. When you go back and look at the history of Europe, it is one war after another for a very, very, very long time.
Right, and in the defense of modern Europeans, it's one of the reasons they're so pacifistic. They've been so horrendously impacted by huge wars, hundreds of years of wars through the medieval times, and then 2 world wars in the last century.
Yes,
both on their continent.
In fact, as a side question, and we're not going to even answer it today, but I'm going to bring it up for you to ponder for a future podcast. Is bravery more or less an inherited trait? That'll be for a future podcast.
Okay, I'll put that in my pocket.
Put that down and be thinking about it.
Okay,
it's a very interesting question as to why Europe might be more passive than say the United States is.
Okay.
So now are you intrigued?
Well, I'm intrigued. I'm inclined to say the bravest among us get picked off. They're the first one to get the arrow
in war.
Yeah.
And the Europeans lost a tremendous number of men who were 20 years old.
Oh yeah,
in the First World War, and then again in the Second World War.
Yeah.
And so these are people who did not have an opportunity to have children.
Right.
And so did you lose
if it's an inherited characteristic, then that logic would apply. The question is it
That's why I ask it as a form of a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. That's really a scientific question, but I'll think about it.
I think it's more philosophical myself.
You do? All right.
I do. But anyway, because I'm not a scientist, but I do consider myself to be an amateur philosopher.
Okay. All right. We'll give an answer whether it's true or not.
Okay. So we're going to get back to so we're going to move forward now. So let's continue on the path forward. And we now have the Constitution, which was written, that provided very limited powers to the national government, but the 2 powers that it did give the national government were the right to impose tariffs or control tariffs and the right to coin money. So the 2 flaws in the Articles of Confederation were moved from the states to the national government. But then other than that, the drafters of the Constitution tried to make the meaningful activity that took place within the United States to be done at the state and local level. and not
Yes.
controlled by the government in Washington. Please.
One of the best ways I've heard that described is the Civil War changed the United States from a small U and a small s, where it was a description of independent sovereign states, to a pronoun, the United States capitalized, which is a collective entity. And the national government has been growing in influence ever since.
Well, now I'm going to push back just a tad on that. I agree with that definition of it. But after the Civil War ended, we went for 50 years. I mean, even when Calvin Coolidge gave a speech in 1923, and in the speech he said that the federal government spent $2.3 billion, and the 2/3 of that was on defense.
Right.
Which meant that non-defense spending in 1923 was about $600 million. We're 10,000 times that now, 10,000 times, and that's in 1 century.
Well, to your prior point, it takes time for these things to develop, and it's been, 1 3/4 centuries since the Civil War, 170-something years. So it took that long for these trends to really become deepened. So I take your point. They really accelerated more after FDR.
After FDR. FDR broke the Supreme Court or threatened the Supreme Court with packing the court, and that's where the term "a switch in time saved the 9."
Yes.
There was a switch. One justice started backing what FDR wanted the federal government to be able to do. Prior to that, the Supreme Court had regularly ruled against nationalizing programs.
Right.
And Social Security was the one in particular. There was also, as an interesting point, the Republicans, when Social Security was passed, Republicans wanted it to be a privatized program because FDR argued that it was a private program. FDR argued that every single American would have a Social Security account and money would accrue in their account. In fact, if you move forward to the 2000 election, you recall Al Gore calling it the Social Security lockbox.
Right.
Lockbox.
Yeah,
and he was referring to every person that has an individual account, which is false.
Yeah, there is no such.
There is no such individual account. But the Republicans, when Social Security was about to pass, tried to make it so that the contributions that people made did go into, at least a portion of it, did go into an individual account like an IRA. And that failed to pass. It didn't pass. And so now Social Security is something that is taken out of every American's paycheck.
Current paycheck to pay prior workers,
to pay
retirees now.
Right.
And we can make the point that, we all have Social Security accounts. They keep up with how much you put into it. And so what you get out is based somewhat on your earnings and what you put in over time. But it's not your money.
It's not your money. And it's also based on whatever the law says at the time that you're old enough to take it out, that you're going to get. The law decides what you're going to get.
Right.
And that law has been changing. For example, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I will say this one was good. They moved the age from 65 to 67 over time. Retirement age.
Yes.
And that's because people are getting older.
Yeah.
And so that was a thing they had to do because people were living longer.
Well, when it started, you retired at 65, and most people lived to 68 or
actually
69.
retired to 62.
62?
Yeah, that was when
it was for a few years, and now people living in the 80s or 90s, and the demographics don't work, so it has to change.
Right. So at any rate, we're moving forward here, and we go through the First World War, we go through the Second World War, and even when Kennedy became president, total federal spending, when Jack Kennedy took the oath of office was $100 billion. We are now 70 times that now, 70 times in less than my lifetime, which is really...
That's still a long time. But it's about, 55 years since Kennedy was inaugurated in 60?
65 years. My math skills are better than yours.
Well, yeah. Yeah, today they are.
Today they are. Not
65
always.
Since 1960. That's right. 66, actually.
Yeah.
This is 2026.
Yeah, well, actually, he was sworn in 61.
Okay, I lose again.
Such a glorious day.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, but that's how small government was even 65 years ago. And so then you get up to Reagan, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but there was a threshold of $1 trillion in 1980. That might have been the national debt passed $1 trillion for the first time under Ronald Reagan, and now it's $38 trillion. It has accelerated enormously in the last 15 years. Under Clinton, with Newt Gingrich's great support, or you might even argue Newt Gingrich with Clinton's support, balanced the budget for 2 or 3 years in around 1998, 99, 2000, right around in that period. And then since then, the entitlement programs have exploded.
You know, decades ago, I read a book called Innumeracy, and it's a counterpart. The author's point was this is a counterpart to illiteracy.
Okay.
And it's our infacility with numbers, our weaknesses with numbers. And one he points out is that giant numbers do not have, we can't understand them.
Right.
We don't have reference. And so now you're talking about 38 trillion and numbers like this, and we don't count things in our range of experience that are 38 trillion.
We don't, but the markets do.
Well, the markets do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, computers can keep track of it. My point is it's hard to fathom really what that means. It's like it's monopoly money. Almost.
Yes.
And it's a really serious issue.
It's a very serious issue, which gets into the next article. So we're kind of brought it up to the current time.
Yeah.
So in this morning's Wall Street Journal, this article written by Bruce Gilley in the Wall Street Journal, the title of it is "What Do Democrats Mean by Democracy?" And it gets into our democratic institutions have become weaker in the last 15 to 20 years. At a rate not seen in my lifetime, where you had times where things got rough, but then they kind of came back to the norm, and now they're not reverting to the norm. They just kind of revert to a new norm.
So let's step back a second and let me try to articulate the way I think about this. Democracy to the ancient Greeks was a small kind of organization where everybody got a vote. Mm-hmm. Like a church or a club or something like that. You might run that as a democracy. Even families, you might have a democracy.
A pure democracy.
So when we now come forward, we don't really have that kind of democracy. We have a representative republic. Mm-hmm. But what we mean by the word democracy is that the people are ultimately in charge. And so our institutions express that, the way we vote, the way we're represented, the way we have minority rights, the way courts are supposed to function to impose the rule of law.
Right. And underpinning the rule of law is equal treatment under the law.
Yes. So that's why we're now talking about the institutions that kind of guard what democracy is. You have this partisan use of the word, particularly, if the other guy gets elected, we're going to lose our democracy.
Right.
It's made with such sanctimony. Those kind of claims are said.
And you hear pundits today claim that Trump is going to not allow the midterms to happen, or he's going to cheat in the midterms, or he's going to run for a third term in 28. There won't be any more elections. So you hear these
claims.
These claims and this is on national TV.
Right.
And the moderators are not pushing back, not saying anything, saying, "Well, where's your evidence of that?" None of that. Right. So you have this kind of what I call this kind of the stirring of the pot. That has that's kind of it's polarizing our politics into one side or the other, and then the question is, according to this particular writer, and this is what I want us to concentrate on today is what do Democrats mean by democracy, and is it different than what you and I might believe that democracy is? And so I'm just going to quote from the very first paragraph, because it kind of sets up his article. He says, "A journal called Liberal Currents recently invited me to contribute to a scholarly symposium on what the editor, Adam Gurry, described as, how can we move to a new, stable democratic regime after Trump?"
So the implication is we do not have a stable regime now. We do not have a stable democratic regime.
Yeah, he says he was particularly interested in what sort of accountability model should be pursued, especially if it has to be done on a partisan basis by a democratic trifecta. I disagreed with the premise and the symposium and declined.
Declined to participate.
He declined to participate. Mm-hmm. But it caused him to think. He says the idea of restoring democracy after Donald Trump is widespread on the left, when we realize what this means, it should prompt our those loyal to our Constitution to shore up the defenses. And so what he does is he goes on. He says there are five
components.
Five components or five things that says we have seen at least five such assaults on democracy as we know it. Okay, at least five such assaults on democracy as we know it since 2016. He says most central has been the denial of Trump's legitimacy. Hillary Clinton in 2019 described Mr. Trump as an illegitimate president who knows that he stole the 2016 election. Trump responded in kind in 2020.
Yeah, this goes back to 2000. Remember the Bush-Gore election and the hanging chads and all that?
Yes.
And the Supreme Court basically came in and said, you can't recount one side and not the other side, and just keep recounting until that side gets the result you want. That was basically what Supreme Court said.
Right.
And so the opposition said this is the authoritarian Supreme Court coming in to put their preferred guy in.
Right.
Ignoring the rationale for why they did
right.
it.
And that's a great point, Mike, because it was at that particular point, that's when the Supreme Court came under attack by the left.
Yes.
As an institution.
Yes.
Now, what's interesting is that for the prior 50 years, the Supreme Court had regularly sided with granting more and more and more power to the federal government, which was the preferred method of government by the Democrat Party for all of those 50 years and still is. The Democrat Party sees power at the federal level as very, very important.
Well, it was a way of realizing their priorities when they couldn't get it in the legislature.
Exactly. That's exactly. And so then he said, then the second assault has to do with the weaponization of the legal system to curtail the opposition, so vividly obvious from the spurious legal cases launched against Trump and his supporters only after he won in 2016 and after he announced plans to run in 2024. So if the institutions or if a party is trying to use the institutions and the levers of power to attack the opposition that's won an election legally by trying to make it impossible for it to govern, or in the case of Trump in the first term they tried to make it impossible for him to govern, and then in the second term they've claimed it's illegitimate. Excuse me. And then in the 4 years after Trump lost and Biden won or was made president, depending on how you look at it, Biden then spent once Trump announced he was running for president, spent the last 2 years before the 24 election doing everything the Democrat Party could to put Trump in prison. Now that's a historical fact. Democrats might say, well, he deserved it. Okay, well, that's okay. That's your opinion.
The Mueller investigation went on for like 3 years.
That was in the first term.
Yes.
Yeah,
this is my point. And it produced nothing in the end, but it kept him on his heels for 3 of those years.
That's what I'm saying.
And it started as Hillary Clinton's strategy after the election.
And Barack Obama's. Because Barack Obama was given, it's now part of the record, he was given intelligence that the Russians had not done anything to affect the 2016 election,
mm-hmm.
and he said, go back and come up with a different answer. And so it was that different answer that then became the logic of Russia for 3 years, and in fact still is. It still is part of the way the left looks at it. And Michael, you and I are being partisan here, but we're being partisan here because this particular columm is written where it's saying
it has a partisan point of view.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. The article has a partisan point of view, but the way that I kind of look at it is that Democrats and many Democrats have maintained that if they get power again, they will eliminate the filibuster. They'll increase the number of Supreme Court justices, and they'll increase the number of states. Now, if they do those three things, so that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of whatever laws they pass, we move from being a constitutional republic to whatever it is you want to describe it, but it's not a constitutional republic at that point. And that's what he is. That's what he is asserting is the risk. That is what he's asserting is the risk. And so the third The third is the explicit assault on other democratic institutions, most notably in the left's targeting of conservative members of the Supreme Court. And then he points out that in 2020, Chuck Schumer stood outside the court and in front of a large crowd and TV cameras said, quote, "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions." And this is a very, very important person publicly attacking the institution of the Supreme Court. Trump will say things about the Supreme Court, and he will. So you could argue that Trump is doing something similar to what
Schumer did.
To what Schumer did. But you also have additional senators who have attacked Clarence Thomas individually, trying to claim that if he went on a vacation with a friend of his who happened to be a wealthy Republican donor, if he went on vacations with a friend of his,
disqualified him as a judge.
It disqualified him as a judge. Now, other judges do that all the time, but they wanted to focus on Clarence Thomas. Then they wanted to say something about his motorhome, that his payment for his motorhome, that his friend ultimately paid off the debt on his motorhome. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's not illegal. Because this particular friend, I don't remember his name, but the friend had no business in front of the Supreme Court, and so he was just a wealthy friend and somebody who enjoyed Clarence Thomas's company and for the last 30 or 40 years. So that is the third one.
We say the third one. These are challenges to the democratic institutions.
Democratic institutions.
Okay, let's run them down. The first one was denial of legitimacy after an election.
Yep.
The second one was weaponizing the legal system
to attack your political opponents.
Now, the third one is assault on other democratic institutions, including Supreme Court, and mentions here voting practices, particularly mail-in voting.
Yes. And
which is an attack on the idea that you need to be physically present and identify yourself in order to have a legitimate vote.
Right. And there are also in some states now, in Maine, in Minnesota, for example, a person who is a registered voter can on election day vouch for the authenticity of up to 8 people
that are there with him.
And then those that are there with him who are not registered to vote.
Yeah.
But he says, oh no, these people are who they say they are, and they live where they say they live. And then those 8 people would then have the right to vote in a Minnesota election.
So I think we can say mail-in voting is very convenient, and it's a well-established practice in a number of places, without necessarily scandal. But it's also obviously open to manipulation and fraud. Especially
in those states that mail ballots to the address of all registered voters.
Yeah, not by request. It's not a response to a request for a ballot. It's just a blanket send out a ballot.
Right.
That can get into anyone's hands.
And in the states that do that, they do not do a good job of keeping their voter rolls, their registered voter rolls, up to date.
Yes.
There are many dead people who are still on there who get ballots. There are many people who have moved to another state, so the person at that address now gets their ballot.
Right.
And so there's a lot of problems with that. And so then the fourth is the mobilization of the deep state to undermine the party in power, seen in the 2019 Trump impeachment based on a frivolous intelligence community whistleblower, and last year in the leak of preliminary defense intelligence assessment that the strikes of the Iran nuclear facilities had been unsuccessful. This one probably is the weakest of the 5.
Yeah, well, impeachment is a constitutional process. It is the way you get rid of somebody you don't like. It's a political process.
It's the way that you're supposed to get rid of somebody for high crimes or misdemeanors, which is not somebody you don't like.
Well, fair enough.
But now it's become let's concoct a reason to impeach somebody because I don't like him and I don't like his policies.
Well, I think there were articles of impeachment filed against Trump within a few days of his inauguration, right?
This time.
Yeah.
By Al Green.
Yeah.
And you know what he claimed and this is a quote. He is being impeached for doing, quote, dastardly deeds.
Okay.
Now that's what is in
That's what it said?
That's what it says in his submission.
So this is our point, is that our institutions, which is supposed to have standards and legal requirements for what it takes to impeach somebody, now is devolved to basically empty words.
Yeah, exactly. And then the final assault is on the use of mass mobilization against democratic government, notably in the Women's March occupation. I had forgotten this. In the Women's March occupation of the Capitol and the Senate complexes in June and October of 2018. I remember the Women's March, but I don't remember them taking over the Capitol because in 2020, taking over the Capitol was reported as something that's never happened before, and that it was a terrible, terrible thing. And while you can argue that it was a terrible, terrible 3 or 4 hours, how terrible it was is open to debate.
But it wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time.
But it certainly wasn't the first time.
I didn't realize they had overtaken the
that they had occupied them for a period of time, and government didn't function for that during that protest, which wasn't days, it was hours, but it had happened. And then they go on and they talk about the Black Lives Matter.
Well, then you had Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street was before that.
I know it before, but I'm saying that's another example of a mass movement to obstruct.
Occupy Wall Street was a well organized, paid for. They documented that. You had some of these
appearance of a mass movement.
Yes,
you had them. You had the George Floyd protests. You have people that find provocations. Now, this is a fine point of semantics. They would not say they find them. They say they are provoked by these outrageous things that happen. You and I might say it seems to happen over and over and over where they find a reason to be provoked and to have a mass demonstration.
Well, and these mass demonstrations, it's very interesting. The No Kings rally this past weekend.
Yes.
They happened in over 3,000 locations, but there were 500 major ones. Do you know how much money it took to organize and put on those demonstrations? $3 billion. There was $3 billion advanced by a bunch of wealthy people and the government employee unions in order to finance these. So many of the people there were paid organizers, and many of the other people who were there were paid to be there. I don't call that
a mass movement.
A mass movement.
Yeah, fair enough.
Although it is certainly undermining institutions especially if you have government employee unions that are organizing and paying for these mass protests that attack the institutions of democracy, of our democracy, right. And our democracy being a constitutional republic. And so what this fellow worries about, he says if we can take Democrats at their word that the next time they have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, if they do what they say they will do, and that is do away with the filibuster, pack the court, increase the number of states, and then proceed to pass a bunch of legislation that is then ruled legal by the Supreme Court. For example, mail-out ballots might be made completely legal and may be required in every state. So what would happen then? And if voter rolls cannot be updated by legislation, they can only be updated every 10 years. What would happen?
I do not understand the rationale for a rule like that you can't update the rolls.
So that you have more ballots going. Michael, what I'm saying is
the effect of it, but what's the rationale?
To retain power. To retain power. If I want to create rules that give me an outsized advantage, where I have to lose an election by 10% in order to lose, then this would be the one that I would do. I would require all states, red states and blue states, to mail out ballots. The red states would sue, and then a packed Supreme Court would rule that the national government can do that. And let me give it a quick example. Here in Tennessee, in 1999, our state constitution, since it was written, at least I think it was since it was written, but for a very, very, very long time, there was language in our Constitution that says that tax on income is unconstitutional, and that was there was a court case, a Supreme Court case back in the 1930s, and it upheld that language in the Constitution on earned income, and so a tax
which
on
is wage income as opposed to interest or dividends.
Yes, correct.
Yes.
And so we had a tax called the Hall tax on interest and dividends, but we had never had a tax on income. And the Democrats were in power in the 80s and 90s, and they badly wanted to have a state income tax because they'd moved the sales tax up to about 9.5% to 9.75%, and they knew they couldn't go to 10% on the sales tax, and they still wanted to expand government, and the government employee unions in Tennessee had a great deal of power back in those days, and we had a Republican governor who wasn't very bright. I don't think he was a corrupt person, but I know he wasn't very bright, so he sided with the Democrats after having taken a promise 60 days earlier in a re-election that he was well ahead. He said an income tax, I'm quoting him, an income tax will pass in this state over my dead body. He said that in 10 days before the election. So he said that in late October. And then in late January, 90 days later, he gave the State of the State address and called for a state income tax.
And what year was that?
That was in 1999.
Okay, well, this is a decade after George Bush, the senior, did the same thing.
Yes.
He said, read my lips, no new taxes.
Yes.
And
But
then,
one is a political promise which destroyed his support within the core of the Republican Party. But the other
in
is
the late 80s, he lost
the
to
other is a constitutional question. And so the language in the Tennessee Constitution had not been changed at all.
Right.
But yet there was this drumbeat for about 15 years that an income tax was in fact constitutional. Income tax was constitutional.
Mean what they say.
You had exactly, and you had lawyers, you had former judges, you had all these people who would say, "Oh, I've read the Constitution, and income taxes is perfectly legitimate under the Constitution." They never cited the language. They said it was unconstitutional, and the Tennessean, which was a very powerful paper back in those days, not very powerful anymore, but every day it would come out with an income tax. In fact, it ultimately had a poll that showed that 70% of the people in Tennessee supported an income tax. But then if you dug a little deeper, here's what happened in taking that poll. The first question was, would you like for the children of Tennessee to receive the best possible education? 98% said yes. And then the next question was, if in order to receive the best possible education, the state would pass a small income tax, would you support that? And the answer to that was yes, because of the first question.
Right.
Now, other pollsters, and that was taken by that poll was commissioned by the Tennessean, and so when they took that poll, the newspaper said these are the questions to ask in this order. Mm-hmm. But then they only reported that 70% of people favored an income tax. Other people who were taking a poll at the same time asked one question: do you want a state income tax? 70% said no. And so ultimately it came to the floor in the House for a vote, and it didn't pass. Right. But at the time, the Democrats thought it would pass. But that was an attack on one of our institutions here in Tennessee, was the state constitution.
We have this going on in several states now with just explicit efforts to raise taxes against the will of the people. You have it in is it Oregon or Washington?
There's a bunch of them, but it's not really against the will of the people per se. In the state of California, the government employee unions are getting they're trying to have a referendum, get enough people to have a referendum put on the ballot to impose a one-time 5% tax on people's net worth above $1 billion. Mm-hmm. Well, if they get that on the ballot in California, that might very well pass. And if it does, it'll have profoundly negative effects on California. In Washington State, the legislature there has just passed a 9.9% tax on incomes. I believe it's above $1 million, but they'd previously passed a significant capital gains tax. But the data clearly shows that these states that pass extraordinarily high taxes on capital gains or on high incomes, they lose high-income people to other states, and they lose it in the billions of dollars. In fact, I'm going to switch over here because I did have this. I have this right here that in California, in 2021, this is fascinating. In 2021, California lost. That was the year of COVID. Okay. Lost $29 billion of taxable income. Moved to other states. $29 billion moved to other states. In 2022, it was 11.9. So if you put those two together, it's $40 billion of taxable income moved. Well, their taxes, the taxes in California are 13.3%. And so if the average of this, because not everybody's in the top bracket that moved, but if the average were, say, 9%, then the $40 billion in just 2 years, that is $3.6 billion of lost tax revenue, 9% times $40 billion. Every year forever. It's every year forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they and since they have announced they were going to pass this tax,
This wealth tax?
yes, this wealth tax, the three wealthiest people in California,
Elon Musk,
Ellison, and the two people who founded Google,
Sergey Brin and Larry Page.
yes, they've all moved.
And Mark Zuckerman.
And Zuckerberg, well, it's going to be really interesting. He moved in January.
Okay.
And the law says that if the law passes, it's for people who are residents of after January 1st, 2026. So
He has moved, but there's a question of whether he's escaped the tax.
Yeah.
But our point is people are moving because of this tax. He has done that. He's moved to Miami, I understand.
Yeah, but it's not just California, who moved mostly to Texas, Nevada, and Arizona. New York lost $9.9 billion of taxable income. Illinois, $6 billion. Massachusetts, $4 billion. And Massachusetts is not a particularly big state. New Jersey, $2.6 billion, so on. But all the blue states that are raising taxes, marginal tax rates, they are losing. They're losing their most productive people, but they're doing it anyway. And that gets to me the core question about what is driving this. And I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. The government employee unions control the Democrat Party because they have a litmus test that they impose on anybody who wants to run as a Democrat for office. And they make you pledge to do four things: increase the salary of government employees, increase the benefits of government employees, increase the number of government employees, and give the unions more control of the work environment, meaning you can't fire people unless they've done something terribly egregious.
So I have a question for you. What happens when they can't pay these demands anymore?
Well,
as income is leaving, budgets get worse, demands keep coming. Mm-hmm. What happens?
They win the trifecta at the national level, and they use the federal government to solve the problems for the individual states that are overextended, and then a packed Supreme Court will say yes to that. Now you get to the next question: is what happens?
Have a federal bailout of the states.
Federal bailout of the states, yeah. And then you get to say, well, all right, now you have that. What happens next? And now we get to another book written by Ray Dalio, where he talks about, I don't remember exactly what the name of it was.
A famous investor.
He was very famous. Well, he set up Bridgewater, was the founder of Bridgewater, one of the great private equity firms,
right.
Investing firms. Mm-hmm. And he's done extremely well, but he also has a great website.
What did he say in his book?
But he said in his book, he says there are two things that cause the destruction of economies. And he says one is war and one is debt, and sometimes they're related. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in Germany, when the First World War happened, it was a combination of the war and the debt that caused hyperinflation in Germany in the late 1920s. It was so bad that they would pay you twice a day and then give you time to go spend the money that they had just paid you
before the prices went up.
Before prices went up, because they were going up constantly. I mean, they were going up constantly.
And another marker, I remember that, is people would carry money in wheelbarrows.
Yes.
And stamps could be worth, I don't remember the numbers, but to us it'd be like $10,000 stamp. You've saved up your money, and now you've got to spend it for a few stamps, and that's all it's worth.
Right.
That's what hyperinflation does to wealth.
Yes, and so it does happen. And then at the end of the Second World War, it was because of the Marshall Plan that allowed Europe to rebuild, and it was all of Europe, and allowed Japan to rebuild. And,
so this was the United States giving aid to rebuild our defeated enemies.
That's correct.
Meaning Germany and Japan.
Yes. Well, and mostly Germany, but some of it was France, some of it was Italy, some of it was probably Great Britain, because Great Britain suffered tremendously.
So it wasn't limited to our former enemies. It was our allies too,
Correct.
France and England.
Yes.
But Italy and
Mostly
Germany and Japan were.
Yes.
Especially Germany was where.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so at any rate, so you have so these institutions. What I maintain, and I is that as long as you have these government employee unions have 7 to 8 million members, and they collect an average of about $1,000 a year
per
employee in union dues. That's $7 to $8 billion. Now, if Elon Musk says I'm going to give $70 million to help elect Republicans to Congress, that makes news. It makes every single news channel. That's 1% of what the government employee unions collect every single year. And they use it to expand the size and power of government. And they make Democrats who want to run for office take a pledge to do the 4 things we talked about earlier. And so I want to go back to what did we say, and we've said this before, is the 4 pillars that underpin a constitutional republic or a free and prosperous society. And those 4 things, those 4 pillars are sound money, low taxes, equal treatment under the law, and low levels of corruption. Now, if those 4 things degrade, and especially if all 4 things are degrading, then that is a recipe to move from whatever you want to call we have now to a truly authoritarian form of government that is masquerading as a democracy.
So any of our listeners who didn't hear a few podcasts ago, I think it was 2 or 3 ago, we spent the whole time on those pillars of prosperity.
Yes.
Right. And I recall there may have been 5. We may have added 1. But those are the main 4.
Okay.
And our point is that this degradation of democratic institutions.
That gets into the corruption side.
Relates.
And equal treatment under the law.
It relates to sound money. It relates to regulation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and low taxes. And so then you look at these states that continue to raise taxes at the behest of the government employee unions, because that's what's driving it in these. That is the driving force in these states. Then you have on top of that, you have all of this fraud that we're learning about from all these federal programs where the states spend a modest amount of money and the federal government contributes 2 or 3 times as much money just by writing a check when they submit the invoice. What we've learned is that the blue states are encouraging fraud in these various programs. And we look at that by looking, for example, at how much money do the blue states spend in total on Medicaid comparing it to their total population.
Per capita?
No, per capita, not per beneficiary, but per capita, which is a really broad way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And the blue states are spending 2 to 3 times as much per year as the red states. And that works out to billions and billions of dollars. And so, and that leads to corruption because under federal law.
It is corruption.
It is corruption because under federal law, the states administer these programs. They do the administration. The federal government funds most of it, the majority of it. And the local government, the state governments, have to license each of these entities, and then has to renew the license every year to say that they are legitimate. Well, some of these entities have been going on for years, and so that means
an unfavorable way of putting this is they're running the scam.
They're running a scam, and with the state's approval to do so, and now this is being uncovered. And so that's another reason to have this gnashing of teeth, because the reason the scams work for the individual states is that if a state spends $1 and the federal government contributes $2, that $3 for the most part is spent within that state. And so the car dealer will get part of that. Restaurants will get part of it.
And the government taxes those people and gets some of their money back.
And so, but it still is compounding the national debt.
Right.
And that gets back to what Ray Dalio said. At some point that breaks down.
So let me ask you a counterfactual question. I ask you, what happens when the money runs out? You have these obligations. What if the federal government does not guarantee the losses? What if they, like under Ford, remember that famous newspaper headline,
Yeah.
Ford in New York, dropped dead?
Yeah.
Which basically was, those are your problems, you solve them, we're not paying for them?
Yeah.
What if the government is not a trifecta on the left?
All right.
And it says, no, that's your problem, you solve it.
Under our Constitution today, a city can file bankruptcy. A state cannot. Under our Constitution today.
Under the U.S. Constitution?
Under the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification.
Because each of these states have their own constitution.
But that's not. But under the U.S. Constitution, a state cannot file bankruptcy.
Okay.
But a city can. So that's why he could say drop dead to New York. Detroit filed bankruptcy. There are other.
Okay. So what happens? They can't file bankruptcy.
That is a great question because they can't really coin money as purely. And if they can't defraud the federal government, if they're caught up on that and they can't do it, at some point the states will have to greatly curtail the government benefits that either go out to the citizens or they have to curtail the size of the government, which would affect the government employee unions.
Well, I would take this a step farther and say they will default on those obligations. They cannot continue to raise taxes enough to catch up and make good all of these pensions and other expenses that they've committed to.
Well, default is a form of bankruptcy. They're not allowed to.
Okay.
They cannot by law.
They don't have the money to pay it. What are they going to do?
They'll have to cut spending. They will be forced to cut spending. They cannot default.
Yeah, I think that there's some
Is there room in there, you think?
I think this is a question of a rock and a hard place. Something's going to have to give. And, are you going to close all your schools and cut all of the funding for current in order to meet these old gigantically
That's a fair point.
Enlarged entitlements? I don't think they will.
Well, listen, I don't want to get going off
That's speculation.
on that. Speculation on that. But your point is it's a good one. But at the national level, it's also a good one. Mm-hmm. Is if our debt gets so high that the markets simply will not give us a low enough interest rate, where the interest rate itself is destroying it, leads to a compounding of inflation.
Yeah,
because you've seen the price of gold go up substantially over the last 100 years. It's gone from $23 to almost $5,000. I think it passed $5,000. It's gone back some
per ounce.
So that's a pretty good indicator of the inflation that's been taking place. But what I'm more interested in this discussion is we see how religion was underpinned the move away from kings and authoritarians to democracy. The divine right of kings was defeated by the arguments that John Locke made in two treatises of government, when he said, no, there are God-given rights that go to the individual, and they don't go through the king, they don't go through the church. They go directly from God to the individual. And that was all part of the argument that went on for about 150 to 200 years. In fact, you can even argue it goes back to the Magna Carta, but I'm not going to argue it goes back that far. But for 150 to 200 years, it went on in certain parts of Europe, and then in the United States, it went on for at least 100. That then led to the democratic institutions that we understand today that I believe are now under assault.
There's big problems and fun to talk about.
Yeah. So, Mike, we'll kind of end it here, and I'm sure that if this gentleman is correct, we'll be talking about it. Unfortunately, we'll be talking about it more in the future. But we'll end it here today.
All right.
Thanks.